All right. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Joanne Brandt. Dr. Joanne Brandt is the author of this wonderful commentary on the Gospel of John, in addition to other books. I'll link to that in the description. I found out about her she appeared on Dale Tuggey's Trinities podcast maybe a month or two ago. And I'll link to that. And I really enjoyed that, and that caused me to buy her commentary and read it. So I'm excited to get to talk to her. I like talking about the Gospel of John, and you seem like something like a great expert. So I would really recommend her commentary. It feels almost like you're getting a classics lesson just by reading through your commentary. You bring a lot of insight from your knowledge of classical literature and drama and rhetoric to help kind of open up the gospel in ways that I'd never thought about before, in terms of comparing its presentation to sort of standard dialogue techniques and dramatic techniques from the time. So I feel like that's really something that makes your commentary unique.
Yeah, well, I'll say a little about my interest in drama and how it fueled the writing of the gospel. Very early in life, I had the opportunity to attend live performances. There was a children's drama series at the Calgary, where I grew up, Repertory Theater, and I started going when I was very young to those performances. And I have always been interested in drama, but I have absolutely no acting skills. So early in life, I decided that I wanted to be an informed audience. And so that fueled my receptivity to seeing dramatic elements in the Gospel of John. Mm-hmm. And it went from there.
Yeah, another thing that I like about your commentary is that I feel like some commentaries or academic works there's two common stripes. One is just the historical critical method so severe that it's not very interesting, where it's just trying to figure out which part was written by which person and how many edits and how many errors and how many things like that. And they almost hardly ever deal with what's saying. And that's like one kind of commentary. Another kind of commentary is, here's why the Gospel of John teaches exactly what my denomination thinks, and here are all the proof verses that you need to notice. And yours is neither of those. It's very respectful in terms of, well, we'll take it more or less how it comes to us, and we'll try and make sense of what it does say, but we'll give it a lot of respect and authority to speak for itself, instead of shoehorning it into 21st century Calvinism or something like that.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I find amazing about the gospel, is that two opposing views can use it to fuel their arguments and feel a sense of certitude about what they're arguing. And I think part of the rhetorical strategy of the gospel was to give the reader a sense of certitude about their convictions, but it didn't anticipate the sort of doctrinal disputes that would follow in subsequent centuries.
Yeah.
So it created its own monster, so to speak.
That's very interesting, and I really want to go into that, but I'm a little bit curious. What was your faith journey like yourself? You're now a professor, maybe a retired professor from Goshen College, right?
I took early retirement so that I could have a few more adventures. I spent some time in India teaching at a seminary there, and had to leave rather abruptly in March, but yeah. So I wanted to end my career with some non-paying adventures in teaching. And, but yeah, I had quite a reasonable career teaching in Mennonite institutions. My own education was very secular, in religious studies departments. I grew up in the United Church of Canada, which more evangelical denominations kind of call that Christianity light.
Sure. It's sort of like a mainline Protestant
It is a
denomination.
mainline Protestant denomination, but like the Mennonites, I think they stress your activity a little bit more than whether you have the right doctrinal beliefs. Like, yeah, the proof of the pudding is in how you act and behave and treat other people. And I very much appreciated that growing up, so ethical emphasis. But you know, I had a pretty typical mainstream Sunday school education with knowing maybe 5 stories that we repeated over and over and over again every year in the curriculum. Paul was sort of reduced to the stories of being shipwrecked on islands because that was the exciting part. And then I had my own little crisis of faith in 1968. My father left. The United States political situation was in crisis. I was, you know, the burgeoning consciousness of people like Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and their assassinations but then the church community really sort of brought me back to my faith. I very much appreciated that my youth group and the church camps in the summer were the real world, and high school and cliques and the one up-mentioned status games that people played was not the real world. And so so I didn't use the language of kingdom living at that point, but very much realized it when I got around to actually reading the Gospels, that this is what Jesus is talking about, how we want to be really present to each other, present to each other's needs. And one of the things, speaking about just Jesus and how he comes across in all of the Gospels, is that Jesus just took people for where they were at and worked from there and didn't work out of categories. And I think that's an important lesson in how to treat people.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I can certainly see why 1968 would be a faith crisis causing year. I sometimes feel like our 2020 seems like 1968 on soft reverb.
Yeah, well, or it sure looks the same when you see the television footage back to back.
Yeah.
Chicago and what's happening in Portland looks very similar.
Yeah, we even have new space achievements going on, which is it seems sort of similar. It's just that we don't have as good of music this time around, so that's a little discouraging.
You just lost some of your audience.
And that was another thing that, like I said before we started recording, I noticed you had a couple allusions to music artists from the 60s and 70s. I appreciate that kind of music. I learned to play like Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix on guitar when I was growing up. So I'm kind of envious of people who got to live during that time live.
Well, I think most people can relate to this. One's knowledge of popular music, or that sort of keeping up with popular music, sort of ends abruptly with the birth of a child.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no idea who most of the performers are who appear at the Grammys now.
Although doesn't that knowledge reappear once they get to about the age of 12 or 13?
Well, sadly, not sadly, my son was just not that kind of guy. So,
sure. Yeah. I have one child. My daughter's about to turn 2, so right now we're just working on nursery rhymes, but I'm sure at some point she'll be teaching me about popular music. So how did you end up in the Mennonite church? What brought you there, and sort of how did that journey happen?
That happened in graduate school. The moment of awakening happened when I went with two Mennonites to a movie. We went to see Witness, and where this New York
Hmm.
City policeman ends up hiding out. Harrison Ford ends up
Yeah.
hiding out with some Mennonites in Pennsylvania. And there's a point in the movie where the grandfather is gesturing to the child, and he holds up his hand like this. And the crowd in the audience is yelling, he's saying, "Get the gun, get the gun." And we're looking around at everybody, the three Mennonites, and he's telling the kid to ring the bell. So all these Mennonites come over the hill, or Amish come over the hill. And I realized at that point, the difference between the audience's reactions to the violence in the film and my own reactions to the violence in the film. Mine matched the two Mennonites I was sitting with and not the rest of the audience. And that began my exploration. I did I was married briefly to a man who was Mennonite. He is now Catholic, and I stayed with the Mennonites.
Hmm.
And now I'm married to the curator of the Mennonite Historical Library, who I think of as Mr. Mennonite. and and I'm sort of am very active within my own congregation, and increasingly writing more for the denomination. That was another goal for the early retirement.
Sure. I went to Mennohaven, which is a summer camp in rural Illinois, as a kid. So I have a small amount of exposure, but I was relatively young, and I'm not sure if I picked up on the differences. I remember we made bread out of wild barley that
Yeah.
was growing on the grounds of the camp. And there was probably some object lesson in that, but I remember it seeming like a lot of work, and it didn't taste very good afterwards. Um, but
This is important biblical knowledge, because the barley loaves are pretty hard and chewy loaves of bread.
mhm.
And I
Yeah,
always point out that the fish are a kind of a relish to get your mouth juices going, so you can eat that stuff.
because it would have been dry and hearty.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess that's fun to get to know you a little better and to understand where you're coming from. So I guess my first question is why in the world is the Gospel of John so different? To me, especially when it comes to questions of theology that we'll get into, the works of John seem almost like outliers to me in the New Testament that are uniquely difficult to understand, and that they sound totally different than the Synoptic Gospels, and that the story structures are different. Some stories are unique to the Gospel of John. Some prominent stories are surprisingly absent. Why is the Gospel of John so unique, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I don't agree with the theories that were prevalent in the first part of or in the 20th century, that John was reliant upon totally different sources and was ignorant of the synoptic tradition. I tend to think that John knows at least Mark, perhaps Luke, and that he's quite intentionally trying to be different. His aims are different for what he wants to achieve, but also he gives Jesus enough time to sort of explore some of the questions of identity that aren't possible in the breakneck speed of the other Gospels, particularly Mark, where immediately and then and everything just sort of rolls out at rapid pace. And if you look at Mark, you have references to Jesus' teaching, but very little about what Jesus said. And so John reduces what Jesus does and then creates opportunities for them people to talk about what that means. So to some extent, I think he's setting up a model for discourse in the same way that Plato did. And Paul Anderson compares John and Plato in the aims of the dialogues are not to end the discussion, but actually to model discussions in a way. So, you have the people who are saying things that Jesus, that they're sort of going in the wrong directions with their questions. And so that models a sort of right direction for us to be taking in our questioning and answers. And so I tend to agree with that he's setting up the terms for discourse about who Jesus is.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that he was somewhat dissatisfied with the previous portrayals of Jesus, or that he felt there was a different take or an additional take that he was sort of felt obliged to bring?
Well, yes, to those questions. I think Matthew and Luke looked at Mark and felt the same, that this was an incomplete gospel and needed a beginning, an origin story. And that decision in John to cast that origin story at creation or in a pre-existence does end some ambiguity about Jesus' status. And I think that's probably in the, looking at what the discourse would be about in the background, people arguing about who Jesus was and how high a Christology was appropriate. It's probably the background, what people are talking about. And John intentionally sets the framework in such a way to make clear. He also addresses what perhaps he's found problematic in the treatment of the crucifixion as to some extent a humiliation, as that there's no asking to get out of it in the garden, no cry of dereliction from the cross. There's no ambiguity that Jesus is human and he dies and that it's a painful death. But John imbues that with such intentionality and such fidelity to God's plan that, and I think that was important to him.
Sure, that makes sense. Even from ancient times, people called John the spiritual gospel. And it really seems, and I think your commentary really helps bring this out, it seems very intentionally crafted in lots of different ways to have almost layers of meaning and different things that you can unpack from it. Whereas the synoptics perhaps are, not to criticize them, but they're just a little bit more on the surface, you might say.
Yeah.
And what do you think it like the early church fathers meant by saying that John was the spiritual gospel?
Well, I do think that and they were grappling with the question of how different John was from the others, and that I recognize already that Jesus is speaking as the resurrected Lord. And so when they're talking about spiritual, I think to some extent they are talking about that sort of heavenly plane versus earthly plane. And so you have the words or the speech of the ascended Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah. That's part of what they're talking about.
Great.
But
so
the way you put it initially, that and some recent scholars like Tom Thatcher have talked about puzzles, Paul Anderson uses the same language, or riddles and puzzles in John, that he gives us this sort of material to tease out and think about. It gives us language that you have to infuse with meaning and test out to see if what you're thinking matches what's going on in the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Matthew and Luke tend to give us Jesus' teaching that you then test out in your own activity and actions.
Right. It's not like the parables in the synoptics aren't sometimes a little bit mysterious and confusing and require some unpacking, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes in the synoptics, Jesus will even then explain a parable afterwards that his disciples didn't understand. But it seems like in John, almost every time that Jesus talks, he's getting misunderstood.
Yeah.
And that almost seems to be part of the point, is that the cued in reader can see what his audience is misunderstanding in him.
Mm-hmm.
And so right off the bat, when John's talking to, or when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, he makes that worldly heavenly distinction. You know, I have told you worldly things and you didn't understand them. Well, what if I told you heavenly things? What? And that dichotomy shows up over and over again. How is that? I think sometimes it's a little bit too easy for us to think that we know what that distinction means. What do you think that really meant in the Gospel of John? What does heavenly things versus worldly things mean?
Yeah, an excellent question with no quick, easy answer. Because when I try it and tease this out and unpack it, it really is an unpacking, because there's so many dimensions or elements in this picture. So you have the Jesus descending and ascending again, heavenly versus worldly, all of the lifting up language, the Jesus crossing over language, the coming again language,
the from above
language, and that all gets tied ultimately to the crucifixion. And so I think we have to keep the crucifixion in view, because in part, the heavenly thing that he's ultimately talking about is the necessity of his own death. And that death that is salvific, in that it's opening a door to eternal life. And it's the means, resurrection is the means by which he returns to the Father. And so death precedes that. And so we're talking about a resurrected reality. We're talking about a spatial way of talking about understanding, because it's very much in the Judeo tradition of revelation as the mode of knowledge and understanding, and Jesus is a revealer. He's come to bring us knowledge, immediate access to God through his own person. And so he's this revelatory character, or he has a revelatory role. And so all of that fits together in this complicated nexus of heavenly, worldly language. Sure.
And I feel like a lot of the stories, a lot of the vignettes in John are Jesus getting in an argument, normally centered around some Old Testament or Jewish symbol of importance, whether it's the temple or Abraham or Jacob or something, where it then becomes the question of, are you more important than Abraham? Are you more important than the temple? Are you more important than Scripture? And Jesus will often then seemingly double down on the confusing thing that's already baffled them. And then they will misunderstand him. And seemingly the point of the story, it is like there is this heavenly understanding of how Jesus is the fulfillment, or the true version, or the heavenly version of the Old Testament symbol. And it almost seems to imply that the Old Testament symbol was the worldly version that is to point to Jesus. But if you're hung up on the worldly thing, you're not seeing it. You're not cued in to what's going on.
Yeah, there's a strong sense that whatever understanding you had, you have to leave behind. That this isn't just the next chapter in the story. For a long time, I wanted to hold on to a notion of a much more integrated understanding of Jesus within Judaism. But I think that Adele Reinhardt's most recent book, Cast Out of the Covenant, really puts an end to that discussion. She mounts a really persuasive argument that what John is doing in his representation of Jesus is taking over all of these concepts, metaphors, cultic items, ancestry from from Judaism, and appropriating them and filling them with Christological meaning that in effect does say that, yeah, what the Judaism has is just encasing some sort, but if they don't fill it with Jesus.
Almost as if the Jewish things were the shadows on the wall of the cave.
Yeah, I think this is why the Platonic reading of John took off in a sense.
Sure.
I don't think that John has that flesh-spirit dualism of Neoplatonism.
Right.
But you can see how you can read Neoplatonism into the gospel quite.
Right. There's John's dualism is more that heavenly earthly thing rather than so man, this could go in there's a bunch of different directions that I'm wanting to go in. I have one of my regular watchers is an Orthodox Jewish guy who detests the Gospel of John and blames it for a lot of anti-Semitism. Yeah. So I guess, and this is a question that you deal with in your commentary. So this is something that I want to talk about a little bit. What exactly is John's relationship to Judaism, and why does he say the phrase "the Jews" so often, and what exactly does he mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think that when he's saying the Jews, sometimes he is referring to temple authorities, and sometimes he's just referring to the crowd. I don't think there's a strong distinction between Galileans and Judeans that some people have tried to find in that language. When he uses the Jews, he's talking about, for the most part, people who have not yet become his disciples. Now, certainly, his disciples are Jewish. His good friend Lazarus is Jewish, but they aren't the Jews, right? So sometimes it's neutral, but for the most part, there's a negative layer to it. I think modern readers, you have to make a distinction between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. He's not anti-Semitic. It's once people have converted over, there's no problem, but he is definitely drawing a distinction between us and them, and the Jews becomes a negative signifier in the gospel more often than not. And that becomes truly problematic. And calling his opponents the sons of Satan. When I look at those dialogues, there's this sort of, they're throwing insults back and forth, but boy, that Jesus sort of tops them at the insult game, and in such a way that it has a problematic legacy that we can't ignore as as readers of the gospel or as people who are using it as scripture, we cannot ignore this problem. And earlier in my career, I tried to argue that I think that maybe there are texts that we can read silently, but we should never read aloud in church. It's like you make a very pointed thing. If the lectionary calls for reading from chapter 8 and you get to that passage, you just don't read it aloud. It's not repeatable. Somewhat analogous to the use of disparaging language for African Americans in Mark Twain, or when we can't pass over things. If you're going to read to your child Dr. Seuss, there are some images in Dr. Seuss that are disparaging of people from Asia. And if you don't point to that out to your child as you're reading the book and say, he did that, and this was, you don't want to use the language of implicit bias yet, a little kid, but explain to them that this is not a good image. We have to do that.
Mm-hmm. How much of that problematic nature can be explained away by better understanding the context and what was meant, and reminding of how different it is from, like, when we hear the Jews or for fear of the Jews, right? We have the Holocaust ringing in our background, the Inquisitions and all that stuff, which is later and somewhat anachronistic to bring back into the first century. How much do you think just better getting back to the context can resolve some of that issues, or do you think it's still trickier than just that?
I think it's still trickier than just that. I do think we have to acknowledge that the rhetorical context of the world, that throwing insults can get quite heated. I can't think of any right off the top of my head, but if you go into the rabbinic literature, they can say some pretty nasty things about each other in different.
And Twitter's kind of like that now.
So there is that. It's a very combative, oral combat agonistic is the language of scholarship. Context that helps recognize this, and that John is setting up this very clear conflict right from the get-go that is going to lead to Jesus' crucifixion, and that heats things up. And he wants to represent Jesus as the one who wins the arguments. And what happens when in these arguments, when the opponent resorts to violence, they've lost the argument, and that all they can do is pick up stones or shut him up by crucifying him. And that's part of what's going on. So that the fact that the historical context is that, on the ground, these are who Jesus is arguing with. Mm-hmm. The Romans execute him. I think the Roman motivation, if we look at the historical Jesus, is very different from the opposition that he's facing from local people. But just think about how, if you go to Jerusalem and break the Sabbath, you're going to find that you face pretty heated opposition from Orthodox Jews. So we have to recognize that there is this religious tension and context, and Jesus' violation of the Sabbath would have really raised the ire of many Jews. So that, without a doubt, there's heated debates, but there's heated debates within Judaism between other parties too. It's part and parcel of the culture. Mm-hmm. But then there is a sense that I think that especially once, if I think about this in the context of the development of Christianity, the early expectations of Jesus' return, and the establishment of the full eschatological vision of Isaiah that the early church held, and it is still very important for our understanding of God's intent for creation, that there was, the sort of initial enthusiasm, but then there is that question of backsliding. Right? We know that there are people who say, well, maybe I'm going to go back to Judaism, or maybe I'm going to go back to paganism because I'm getting a lot of heat from my family, my
Right.
community, and Christianity is the something new in town, and that new is not truer.
Right.
And so this construction of the Jews, and this is in Reinhardt's book, that he constructs the Jews in such a way that they become the object of fear, so you stay away from them. So if you look at the same sort of thing, and we can compare this to Jim Crow laws, and that, the great fear of misogyny. So you represent African American men as something to be feared and needing to be restrained, and it keeps you away from them, and keeps the culture separate by constructing a picture of the other.
Right, and it prevents deconversion to that side.
Yeah. And I think that is a concern in John, that in this formation of something new.
Right. So you can imagine that if a lot of the converts and a lot of the members of his church are from a Jewish background, maybe they left their families and their, community enclaves in the cities that they were living in to go out on a limb and be part of this new Christian group, then they've suffered a lot of consequences for that. And they're probably still under pressure to come back into the fold. That part of the purpose of the Gospel of John is to reassure people of what they believe, like you said, and to help establish a boundary and incentive to keep people on the inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's that sort of language that led to hypotheses that John is a sectarian document, that the community itself is really, really narrowly confined and separate from the Petrine community. And most scholars now reject that narrow view of the insider language of John, but there's definitely insider-outsider language.
Yeah. So speaking of insider-outsider language and groups leaving other groups, you mentioned in your talk with Dale Tuggy that you like Larry Hurtado, and he's one of my favorite early church historians. I'd really wanted to talk to him. He passed away recently, unfortunately. But he talks a fair amount about the secessionists, or the group that left the Johannine community, and that they seemingly looked Gnostic-ish. He doesn't like the word Gnostic, but sometimes even he can't avoid using that word. And what do you think? So we talked about the relationship of John to Judaism. What do you think the relationship of the book of John is to Gnosticism and the Johannine community to Gnosticism?
Yeah, I am really vulnerable to being persuaded when I read other scholars in this discussion. That question of the relationship of the epistles to the gospel. And I can't argue it out myself, but I have this inclination, or I have this, maybe it's just a desire to agree with those who want to put the letters before the gospel and see this as, as this shoring up process after this secessionists. And it's quite clear in the epistles that these people leaving are moving in a direction maybe more docetic than Gnostic, where Jesus' incarnation, the fleshly life, is less significant. Whereas in John, the gospel then provides a telling of the story that looks at this tension between Jesus, who is clearly identified as the son of Joseph, but his primary identity is the Son of God. And you have in the gospel then Jesus balancing out these two identities. And I sort of argue that in the commentary that when Mary sort of outs him at the wedding of Cana, he has to distance himself from his family. He's sort of distancing himself. There's a tension between being a human being and being the Son of God, and fulfilling human and familial responsibilities and fulfilling his responsibility as the Son of God. And that's played out throughout the gospel. And then on the cross, Jesus resolves it by being a good son, by handing on his responsibility to the beloved disciple. And I think that's really important. He's the good son of God all the way through, but he's not necessarily the good son of his biological family and until the end.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's an interesting point. It's like there are times sometimes when I read the Gospel of John and wonder how Gnostic-ish it is itself. And certainly it's not docetic in that way. Clearly Jesus is a human being. Clearly Jesus really dies. He's absolutely clear on that. So when it comes to that sort of strain of Gnosticism, it seems like he doesn't want any part of it. But in terms of this sort of the in-group who gets it and the out-group who doesn't get it, and this sort of highly spiritualized understanding of the importance of things, it seems kind of that way, or at least flirting in that direction. I don't know what you make of that.
Yeah, well, I think that it probably belongs, now I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm not a great scholar of the Gnostic literature, read the Nag Hammadi material and read secondary scholarship on the question. But I think that we're looking at a milieu where there's no Docetism at this point. And this becomes highly disputed how clubbish these groups were. We have lots of literature written by individuals when we get into the Gnostic, into the Nag Hammadi material, that we have no idea how widespread this literature was. But we do know that this discussion about knowledge and knowing and was something that is in the air, and revelation and revelatory figures are very important in Judaism. And so to some extent we have this sort of elevation of Jewish understanding of true knowledge as being revealed to something a little bit more philosophical, a little bit more speculative in this context, but it still relies upon this revelatory figure. And yeah, so that's critical in Gnosticism, but it's also critical in Judaism. Mm-hmm. And so probably if we're kind of looking at John in this continuum of development, you can see why he gets cited in the Gnostic literature, but not exclusively. One of the things that scholars of Gnosticism and John point out is that there's sort of this dreadful silence in the 2nd century about John in general. Nobody's citing him in the 2nd century till the end of the century, and then already in the first sort of reference to this debate, and it's
Irenaeus, right?
that it's like he's saying that John is writing to refute these people, and he's doing what we talked about right at the beginning. Look at, I'm right. It's in John.
Right. And John seems to be pliable to multiple purposes.
Yeah.
We know that the Gnostics wrote commentaries on the Gospel of John favorably, and then we know that Irenaeus, who was the fierce anti-Gnostic, also used John to refute the Gnostics. So it is interesting how it can kind of go in both directions. So
Yeah.
so now I'm curious to ask you a little bit more directly about John's Christology, and what exactly John imagines Jesus to be. And I guess this, to tell you a little bit more about myself and help you understand where I'm coming from. I'm a biblical Unitarian, or a conservative kind of Christian Unitarian, but I have grown up mostly in Trinitarian evangelical churches and culture. I grew up originally in Unitarianism, and then kind of had a mixed upbringing, and then in college was mainly involved with Trinitarians and stuff like that. So I have somehow stuck to my guns through all that process, and am still on the Unitarian side of the fence. And every once in a while that gets me kicked out of a community, or literally excommunicated from a church. So when John seems to relate to getting kicked out of synagogues, that's part of that's something that I kind of share in solidarity a little bit. But it is certainly the center of arguments or disputes when I will be having over this doctrine. It's almost always the Gospel of John that comes fresh to people's minds to discuss these questions with. But I'm not just trying to leverage the Gospel of John to win a 21st century debate. I really do care what he means. And of all of the books in the New Testament, the one that gives me the most discomfort sometimes is certainly the Gospel of John. But I often think that he is really easy to misunderstand, but I don't feel like I fully understand him myself. So that's just kind of to not be blindsiding you, for you to understand sort of my motivations and where I'm coming from. But I guess the question, one question to help direct this is, does John imagine Jesus pre-existing his human career? And if so, in what state, or what did he pre-exist as?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, as a Johannine scholar, I'm trying to read from the 1st century rather than back from the 21st century or the 4th century or whatever. So this ontological question, I don't think John gives us much to work with.
Right.
And in saying that, I don't think this is at all interesting to John. He's interested. The two titles, Son of God, Son of Man, are really critical.
And Christ. Yeah.
It is quite clear what Jesus' role is in coming. The question is, where's the authority for that role? And that is grounded in this pre-existence. Right? And John moves to a metaphoric answer to your question. What is Jesus? Where is he? He's with God in this heavenly space, watching God work and learning from God by working alongside God. So it makes me think of all those Sunday school pictures of Jesus in Joseph's workshop, sawing wood with Joseph, with all sorts of medieval tools. And and in some ways, I always disparage that image, but I think it's an important image because this is what Jesus is doing. This is ancient education, but it's also what gives him authority, because this is an economy where you inherit your father's role, you inherit your father's status, and a good son who is the agent of the father has to be respected, because to ignore the authority of the son is to ignore the authority of the father. And so this is really what he's doing, is he knows what God's intent is. He knows how God works, knows God's interested in creation and life, has the authority to judge. And these all come from the Father. Mm-hmm. And so we have much more of a spatial view with heaven and earth, or heaven and the world, above and below sort of language, but we have to treat that metaphorically, because they knew that this is a metaphoric language to describe something that our human minds can't quite comprehend.
So you're depicting Jesus as something like the apprentice, the loyal and faithful apprentice of God.
Yeah. So yeah. So but this is, it's not mythology in that John doesn't present us with the sort of stories of Jesus misbehaving. We have those stories of Jesus misbehaving,
right,
as the human son,
yeah,
that are, answer the question, what would it be like to have divine powers and be 5 years old?
Right, the making clay birds and having them attack the other kids, right?
Yeah. There's, gotta pause, reset my thoughts for a second. So that's where I tend to focus, is at what do the metaphors give us about Jesus' identity? Why did they work? Why were they compelling in that context? And then how they then inform the way we think of him now. And I think also in terms of, when we talk about him and God and his capacity to reveal God, there is this knowing aspect, and it's God's intent. He knows God's intent. And it's not, God has told me to say this to you. These are what, he knows what that means. He knows what the plan is. He knows. Yeah. So he knows what it's about.
And that's what the language of I'm in the Father and the Father is in me and I and the Father are one, that's the sort of thing that's trying to be communicated by those sorts of passages.
Yeah. And the unity language is so important. And we see it in Paul and we see it in John. And so here we see, the milieu in which both of them are operating is in the unity of the Father and Son is critical.
Yeah.
And in part, it's that how does Christianity understand how it is related to the Old Testament and Judaism, and how can it argue that it is in continuity that it isn't something new or different, that it's part of this original intent that God had to send his son and to then broaden the covenant to all people. It's, there's lots of places where it can dip into the Old Testament, but once you have this figure of Jesus giving life and acting as judge, these are two divine prerogatives.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus is, is then ontologically, as in his being, is divine. And that opens up the question, well, then is he created? Is he, is there an apotheosis? Does he become divine? And John says, no, he always has been. He always was. This isn't something developmental. This is perfect unity with God. And in part, I think it is their way of getting out of the accusation that you're creating two gods.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have the building blocks or the development of a Trinitarian tradition that is inchoate, it's in progress.
Sure. So does the Gospel of John have a different view of who God is than the Jewish setting around him? Because it seems like of all the different things that they argue about, kind of the nature or identity of God doesn't seem to be one of the things under dispute in the gospel. How you get to God, how you know God, what God is up to, who he is working in and who he is not working in, those are the disputes. But in terms of there being one true God, that doesn't seem to be on the table of dispute.
Yeah. How you be in relationship with God is the question. And in Judaism, you're in relationship with God by fulfilling the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings a sort of an intimacy with God. Prayer,
the temple cult.
Ritual, So all of these things are bringing this relationship with God. And the Gospel of John says, no, that there's a greater intimacy and a truer intimacy that happens when you're in relationship with Jesus. Because he and God are like this. And so to know the Son is to know the Father. And it is about, when we talk about knowing in both Judaism and in John, I think they are on the same page in that they're talking about relationship. It is being in relationship with God is what this knowledge is really about. And that relationship is characterized by love. It's characterized by joy. And both of those things are very Jewish. And
right. So
what John doesn't stress as much is the righteousness. And if he knows Matthew and Luke, then he's, they've covered that. I don't need to do that. I'm dealing with this other part.
Right. And in the letters, in the Johannine epistles, he deals a little bit more with behavior and loving community and that sort of thing, and doing the commands that you've received and stuff like that. But in the gospel, that isn't a prominent theme. So I guess, so it seems to me like there are only seemingly 2 times in the gospel where the word God might be referring to Jesus. The other times, all the other uses of the word God are just the Father. And when Jesus is talking with the Jews about God, there isn't seemingly any confusion about who's being talked with. The question is you need to get to him through me now or not. So to me, it still is unclear to me what exactly John imagines Jesus as in a way that doesn't break the monotheism.
Yeah. Well, and I think he's looking at this sort of through the lens of the Shema. So we have in the Shema that unity between God and the community by loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might. Now I'm getting mixed up with this is a deficit of my education, biblical education. Never got good at rolling scripture off my lips. But in any case, that unity that is so critical in the Shema, which is so critical to the Jewish identity, gets played with. It gets played with a lot in Paul, and it also seems to be in the hinterground for John as well. And so this sort of oneness that he's aiming at is about intent, more than about being.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not that kind of speculative theology in John. But I think that John does give us enough to say, like, I have trouble wrapping my head around any Trinitarian articulation at times. But the basic concept that all of these are working together to the same end, and that if the Spirit is moving you, then that's what God's intent is. Because the Spirit isn't going to deceive. And I think that's sort of our understanding of, how these three things work together.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's not. If we think about other incarnational theologies, it's not the same as Krishna. You have Vishnu, and Vishnu incarnates as Krishna, and Krishna doesn't then talk to Vishnu and ask him for advice or guidance or pray to him or talk about him as other than himself. Mm-hmm. So there's no emptying himself of Vishnu or becoming something separate. In John, we have this image. It's not that God sort of dislocates a part of himself and as an emanation of God, but you have this representation then of this community, this household of God. And that's not un-Jewish in that it's a very crowded heaven. Mm-hmm. In Judaism. Protestants tend to have sort of emptied heaven a little bit too much for it to be truly biblical.
Yeah.
I've just got up there, and there's a lot more going on up there.
in their imagination. Yeah.
In their imagination. And so, but what is being made clear is that Jesus is truly unique and truly for all time absolutely in authority without doubt. And so you can be totally confident. There's the absolute, the rhetorical aim is to feel this unwavering sense of confidence that Jesus' word is good and that Jesus is the means by which salvation is achieved. And
right. So
yeah.
So I have another question that kind of gets into this is, do you think that John imagines that we believers will become what Jesus is? That Jesus is kind of like Jesus is that idea of him as our forerunner or the first fruit of the dead or something like that, where we, through faith, we become one with Jesus just as him and the Father are one, like Jesus prays, or he is in, we are in him, and he is in us, and Jesus is in the Father, right? Like those prayers seem to suggest that the goal is to bring us into the same sort of unity that Jesus has, and that
Yeah.
we become what Jesus is. Do you think that's
No, I
in
don't think
John's
that it
mind?
goes that far. I can see how one could push it that far, but I think the line is still drawn between Jesus and God on this side, and Jesus, the only Son. And we are children of God, but we never usurp that Son's role in this picture. And I think the representation of the disciples is sort of critical to this, because, they just are bumbling all the way through to the bitter end. And they're never represented as attaining any sort of perfection whatsoever. And so I think that perfectibility of there isn't a perfection of human being in the Judeo and the Christian traditions. The perfection of our faith sort of language is more the telos of our faith, the fulfillment of our faith, coming to completion, not that at the end of the day we are in some ways that we have this perfect attunement with God. I don't think it presents that sort of picture at all, and I think it saves us from that with the representation of the disciples as comical characters all the way through.
And that's part of what you think is meant by monogenes, maybe. Yeah. And you take monogenes to be one of a kind, not only born or only begotten, right?
It's not the begotten language. The only born Son sort of suggests there's other ones drifting around up there.
Yet to be born?
Yet to be born, or so, so, it's one of a kind. I think it's stressing his uniqueness, not stressing the incarnation in that language. Yeah.
But it would still fit in with all the sonship language and the like the I am the Son ruling over the house, and that can bring you in and set you free indeed.
But Jesus is born into this world through the mediation of Joseph and Mary. And he's not born in John.
Right. Well, so that's an interesting question, is how do you think John related to virgin birth narratives? You said you think that he had Mark. Well, Mark doesn't have a birth narrative, but you said he probably might have had exposure to Luke. Do you think he believed in the virgin birth? Why would he leave that out? He obviously mentions Mary and Joseph, but why don't we get a birth, and how exactly do you think John imagined Jesus's birth?
Yeah, well, that's a highly speculative question.
Sure.
But it could be that he's quite satisfied, and he doesn't want to muddy the waters anymore by having another birth narrative. So that could be it. So that's where I would leave it.
Now I have a couple of questions that I want to ask, maybe about the prologue in specific. So when the Word becomes flesh, when in the timeline is that? Because we've already spent a decent amount of time talking about John the Baptist and other things going on. And the Word became flesh. When is that happening, I guess?
Yeah.
Or is that too sharp of a question on too fuzzy of a statement?
I think we're looking at poetry here. We're not looking at narrative. And so, we have this, in the beginning. And yeah, we're sort of zooming in here from this cosmic picture, and we're zooming into the earth and, coming into the world, becoming incarnate and fleshed. And so there's not, that specific moment. I think it has to be at birth, but then, it's that, how come they're not interested in what Jesus is doing all this time? And it's not part of what that generation was interested in, or the early church, or that they thought was necessary to the story. The important part of the story is Jesus' public ministry, and then his death and resurrection. That's the important part of the story. And so the birth narratives in the other Gospels help explain who Jesus is, and help set up the sort of the conflicts of the Gospels, or the plot lines of each of the Gospels. And in the same way, John is using the prologue to set up where the conflict will be, and it will be about this coming into the world as the Word, as what the Word is with God from the beginning. And so that's where it will be. And in some ways, I think that sort of the poetic language invites us to do a free play with ideas, but also helps us recognize that these are going to be contested terms.
Sure. So a question that I wrestle with is, so there's all this ascending and descending language, right? There may be 5 or 6 times where it seems to imply that Jesus has come down,
and he's going back,
and that he's going back, right? And that he's going back to where he was before, and those sorts of things. Is how literal is that, versus like in James, like the book of James will say every good and perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights, or like when you do good deeds, those are from above, and stuff like that. Is this like a highly dramatized, idiomatic way of talking that is a mistake to take it too literally? Or is it really that John imagines Jesus as having been some sort of personal agent up in heaven, who then in some literal incarnation transportation is now here on earth, and then he will go back? I guess this is a real tension that I have when I'm trying to understand John. Is all this ascending stuff just or is the descending part, I think the ascending is at least pretty literal, is the descending part just this metaphoric Jewish way of talking about something being good or something being godly, or is it more cosmologically straightforward than that?
Yeah, I think that, John, it's cosmological. We have a sense that there is a cosmological battle going on in the background, and I think it's cosmological, not just, Jesus is just, how good is he? He's this,
Right.
I'm reaching for my superlatives. This is indisputably a good thing. No, I think there's a cosmological narrative, and that there And to some extent, I think it does rely on the fact that there's just a whole body of literature with ascending and descending beings, and so it's not dramatic that something is coming from, that a being is coming from above, and we have, you know, the yeah,
like the ascension of Isaiah.
Yeah, we have lots of ascension things, but there's, you know, we have these sort of heavenly beings who come down and facilitate these ascensions. And so throughout the Old Testament, you have angelic figures, but John is making clear that Jesus is not this heavenly messenger in the form of this angelic being.
So you don't think that, because like in the ascension of Isaiah, Isaiah, you know, gets this vision where he climbs up like the 7 layers of heaven, and then is in the highest heaven, and he sees the pre-incarnate Jesus and the pre-incarnate, or the Holy Spirit angel, and they like worship God, and then like God sends Jesus, and Jesus has to like go down through all the 7 layers of heaven, and then he like becomes a human being, and then he climbs back up the 7 layers of heaven again, and it's very elaborate, but it's also that's like a clear image of ascending and descending, where Jesus is a pre-existent heavenly being of some sort, but it almost seems like Jesus is like the chief angel of heaven, or maybe angel isn't quite the right word, but like the prince of heaven or something like that.
Well, or, you know, if you look at what happens in the book of Revelation, where the angels are all, or, you know, the elders and this heavenly retinue are all worshiping the throne of God, and then you have this moment of revelation, and then all of a sudden they, you know, they take off their crowns and they cast them, and that they begin, you know, they recognize the Lamb, and that my reading of the book of Revelation is that the act that prompts all of these sort of turning their attention and recognizing that they need to be worshiping Jesus as well as God is predicated in the book of Revelation on Jesus' crucifixion.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So it is, even in heaven, they have this moment of revelation, right? That, oh, this is who this is.
That's an interesting point. Even the heavenly council gets a revelation.
Yeah.
So how do you connect the book of Revelation to the gospel, and do you think it's the same John? Is it the same community, or how connected do you think those 2 works are?
Well, I think that, you know, I date the book of Revelation as later than John, and that there's some knowledge of John in playing in the same sort of ethos. And so I don't think it's necessarily the same author. I wouldn't think, you know. So, but I do think that there's enough affinity in some of the language at times. There's enough affinity in its Christology. And
although an interesting difference, and right there in where you're talking about in Revelation 4 and 5, in Revelation 4 you have the elders and the beasts worshiping God, and God seemingly alone, right, in worship. There is no Jesus around.
Yeah.
And then it's like, look, you know, the root of Jesse, or the Lion of Judah, the root of Jesse, he has triumphed. And then the Lamb sort of gets brought up into the heavenly throne room, and then worship gets reoriented, and there's a new song that they sing, and there's God, and then at his right hand there's the Lamb, where it seems like there's a sequence from just God to now God and Jesus together.
Yeah.
Whereas John, the gospel, seems to be Jesus was presumably up there, descends, and then ascends to back to where he was before, right? And that's also a difference between like John and Paul, or John in the other Gospels, or John in the book of Acts. Like the book of Acts and all the letters talk about Jesus's exaltation a lot, right?
Yeah.
Jesus has been raised to God's right hand. He has been exalted into the heavenlies. He has been enthroned. You know, like in the book of Hebrews, he enters into the heavenly holy of holies, and right there's this idea of newness to Jesus's position and exaltation, whereas John never emphasizes that theme. There is no exaltation, there is ascension that
Yeah.
seemingly is parallel to descension.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, and I agree with you on that. So, and it does invite these, especially when we consider the context and the milieu in which this is being written, you can see why it invites all sorts of imaginative renderings of a sort of a mythology, or, you know, what's going on in heaven. Yeah, John wants to avoid new, and maybe that's because this whole problem of saying that we're, you know, this isn't a new thing. We're not making up gods. This is something that has always been, is what he wants to affirm. But he has to acknowledge that the revelation brings a new understanding of worship.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, yeah, it's an interesting question. So what is the basis of worship? And Paul makes it clear that, you know, it is in the Christ hymn, it's, you know, because he submitted even unto death on a cross, therefore every knee shall bend in heaven and earth.
Right, and he's been exalted by God,
Yeah,
seemingly to receive these. Yeah.
So, but John doesn't have that emptying, that, and then the exaltation.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he does, yeah, and I think he's trying to get out of this problem of the genesis of a new God.
Yeah.
By having Jesus' authority always there, and having him have such clarity all the way through about what he's supposed to be doing.
Right. There's no progression in Jesus's personality, really, in John. Jesus is very unwavering and very consistent, and stuff like that. Like the book of Hebrews will say Jesus was perfected through suffering. And, you know, the other synoptics will say that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and standing among men, and stuff like that. And John almost seemingly intentionally avoids any of that sort of idea. Jesus shows up on the scene as an adult. We don't even get a baptism. We kind of get a hint that there might have been a baptism, but we don't want to go into that. I think like you've said, and like a lot of other people say, I think he was wary of people that took John the Baptist too seriously. So I don't think he wanted to give John the Baptist credit for that. I don't think he wanted to give ammunition to the Baptist sect or something like that, by mentioning it.
Yeah, he's not, there's no authority to which he's submitting that's human.
Right.
Yeah. So that's, I think his aim is very Christological. And yeah, of Jesus, this reliability, you can rely on him, and this was God's intent all along. So these are the sorts of things that make this book a perennial
yes,
topic
perennial. So I guess a tricky thing that I wonder, so in what sense was Jesus, if Jesus really, if we really are to understand John trying to communicate that Jesus was a personal being up in heaven prior to descending, it's like, where was he and what was he up to, and why hadn't we heard from him before?
Yeah.
And I guess really the only passage that sort of addresses that is the dialogue about Abraham.
Mhm.
Like, what do you think is going on in that, before, that this is a passage that gets thrown at me quite a bit, but did Abraham just prophetically see that the Messiah would come, or did he have some sort of revelation into heaven where he actually saw Jesus before he comes down? Or what is the Abraham looked forward to my day and he saw it and was glad business?
Yeah. Yes, because if you look back at Genesis, we've got the God's promise that through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And as Christians, we understand that as Jesus and the opening up of the covenant. And when you look at the story in Genesis, Abraham is saying, kids, land? And the other thing just is an abstraction that,
Mm-hmm.
there's no indication that he has any awareness in the gospel or in the book of Genesis of what in the world this promise is. So yeah, I think he was glad for does Jesus, is the intent simply that this promise, this being gifted this promise made him happy? Or
Mm-hmm.
does it imply that he really had cognizance of what it all meant?
Right.
Yeah. And how many other sort of ascension narratives do we have for Abraham floating around to which you might be referring?
Mm-hmm.
We've got this small body of Jewish literature from the time. What other stories were floating around that were part of the
Right.
people we're familiar with? We don't know.
Right. So is John saying that Abraham saw Jesus in heaven, or that he was just reassured of, he like had some prophetic vision of the future?
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have enough to go on.
Yeah. And then,
Interesting questions. Yeah, these are the kind of questions that prompted people to write the pseudepigrapha
yeah.
and apocryphal literature.
So then when Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am,
Yeah.
this verse, oh man, the amount of trouble this verse has given me, but what is going on? What is he saying exactly? And because isn't it even in a certain sense grammatically incorrect?
I know the tenses are, the playing with tenses in the gospel, I think are quite intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And jumping from past tense to historical present in certain times in the narration. And in this case, that I am language, it has to invoke the name of God.
So you did say that in your commentary, and I have to say I remain pretty unconvinced that just saying ego a me is, or I am,
Oh yeah,
or I am he,
yeah.
is invoking the divine name. Because like just a couple verses after this, the blind man, they're looking, who was the blind man that was healed? Oh, I am the one, right?
I know. And John the Baptist, the I am not. So we have others, but yeah, I don't.
you know, when Jesus is walking on the water, he identifies himself to his disciples that same way. Like, I imagine like an average person walking home from work and knocking on his door, and his wife saying, "Who is it?" And he says, "Oh, it's me," right? Like, you know, that, like, I don't feel like such a common grammatical phrase could
Yeah.
alone be invoking the divine name.
Yeah, but as you pointed out, we have this strange tense thing.
It is, well, it is a strange tense. Yeah,
And that
it is. It's
it
seemingly
flags,
intentionally incorrect, grammatically incorrect.
but I certainly would not think you were a heretic for not agreeing with me.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But even then I wonder. So even if he is just saying it is me, why is he saying that then, right?
Yeah.
And is he identifying himself as the one that Abraham looked forward to, right? Is it is
Yes.
me just a way
Yeah.
of saying that I am the messianic figure whose day Abraham
Yeah.
foresaw?
The seed, and
Yeah.
um, yeah, um, that makes perfect sense as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a nice thing about John. Is that uh, I think that there's an excess of meaning here, and and the ambiguity of language is meant to delight and to stimulate reflection and thought, and it is not, I do not think he's giving us the building blocks to nail down a perfect, complete theology or cosmology. uh, that that wasn't his intent, but I do think his intent is to promote exactly these kinds of discussions and reflections that treat it seriously,
Mm-hmm.
that say, that we need to be earnest in our ponderings about this. This isn't, about arguing whether the Marvel universe is better than the DC universe or something like that. Though people seem to be very passionate about these things.
Yeah.
But that there's a reverence in reflecting on these things that's important, but also a delight in,
Mm-hmm.
he's it's and in that respect is quite Jewish, and that there does seem to be it might seem a bit arrogant to think you're writing scripture, but clearly there is a sense that he's writing authoritative literature.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And
that's also another good question, is what did John think that he was up to?
yeah,
And
yeah. Well, at some points, Paul is quite clearly providing liturgy in his letters. And I think John is quite clearly providing, this is not a one-time read sort of thing.
mm-hmm.
And he's giving language to faith. And so.
And I think one of the amazing things about the Gospel of John that I think just is why it keeps inviting reflection is that it's capable of using relatively simple language and vocabulary, right? Like, if we were to put the reading level of the Gospel of John compared to the other books of the New Testament, its vocabulary and stuff is actually relatively simple. It would be like on the middle school shelf in a school library in terms of reading comprehension ability.
Well, it's
And
this why it's the book that's used in seminary Greek classes,
right.
because it has lots of lovely repetition of vocabulary, and his Greek is not the best, though he seems to have a poet's soul.
Right, right. He
And
can, he
use it
uses
poetically.
simple tools to do perhaps the most deep and complex and contemplative work in the whole New Testament
Mhm.
with a relatively rudimentary vocabulary. And I think that is an extremely hard thing to pull off.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that he isn't giving simple answers like dialogues can do. It invites further and further reflection, and like we started all the way in the early part of this conversation, this heavenly and worldly divide, it's hard to get people to think that way if they aren't used to it. It's hard to, it's like an experiential way of viewing and seeing things that you can't necessarily just instruct someone with words how to do, but he sort of invites you and drags you in with the way that he's able to tell the story to try and get you to think and see this way, to exercise a muscle that you might not have used before.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Mm-hmm. And your commentary is really good at connecting with all of the different rhetorical stuff, rhetorical techniques from the ancient world that he would have been sort of familiar with and drawing on.
Yes, and well, helping people recognize that in that repetition, that or in the construction of the dialogues, that there's multiple purposes that are being served, that in the various progressions, and some of it is to help the readers by circling around and reminding, and some of it is kinds of digressions, and the role of his dialogue partners tends to be ways of getting Jesus going again, and the way that the language will build, and the way that the language actually sounded, that I think is important, and we lose that very often in translation. So
right, it's hard to translate alliteration or
yeah,
those sorts of sound noises.
yeah, that was very, very important in the ancient discourse, the way things sounded and the sorts of rhythms, and recovering them to some extent can be just a matter of delight to us, but it also can help us understand where we shouldn't get bogged down in questioning differences in words and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess there's a historical question lurking in that. So if John or someone in the community was an authoritative eyewitness to these things, Jesus wasn't going around making double entendres in Greek with Jewish leaders at night, and wasn't, rattling off these alliterative punctuations in Greek, presumably. How are we supposed to bridge the gap between what seems to be a highly stylized and intentionally composed work in a language that works in the language in which it's written, but is clearly also probably not the language Jesus was speaking when he was doing these things?
Yeah, this of course for the modern mind, it becomes very problematic, because we want what Jesus actually said, and to say that Jesus didn't actually say this in some way or other in some people's minds means that then suddenly the whole thing will go up in smoke and you'll totally lose your faith. But if we want to assign historical credibility to the speeches of Jesus, we need to look in the Synoptic Gospels. I do think there's probably lots of things in the Gospel of John that perhaps could be tied to Jesus' speech, but we can't do the triangulation of sources and do any sorts of proofs that the modern mind likes to have. But I do think that there's a lot of speech that is composed for the occasion, and it's not seeking to replicate or echo the way Jesus spoke at the time. I like the idea that Jesus liked to repeat amen, amen, and we get that from the Gospel of John, but there's no way to prove that, and that's something I would like. But I do think that, as the language of faith, it's very, very important. And it does give us our Christology. And I tend to be of the mind that maybe this is sort of American pragmatism. This has worked for a very long time for Christians. Who am I to say that this is, that we should throw this all out and try and build another Christianity based on whatever pieces of the Bible we consider most credible. But I'm very comfortable with the idea that a speech can be inspired by Christ without having actually been uttered by Christ. And I think that's what we have here.
And that it requires putting some amount of trust in the teacher that is connected with writing the gospel itself, and trusting that he knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
Well, I think that might be a relatively good way to wrap this discussion up.
Okay.
Do you have any other last things that you want to say?
Not that I can think of. You know how it goes.
Yeah.
In and out. I think, oh, why didn't I say that? But
well,
that's the way it goes.
That is the way it goes. That is the strength and weakness of dialogues, and ones that get recorded at least.
Yeah, recorded dialogues are a little bit scary for me still.
Sure.
In teaching in the classroom, it's like, you're just sort of hot wind, vanity, and it just sort of goes poof in the air, and the students remember the oddest things. But this is a little bit more permanent.
Yeah, it's a weird in between.
Yeah.
But people seem to enjoy it. I think people find. I think that YouTube and podcasts really have opened up an untapped ability in people's day to listen to content that they couldn't read before, right? When you read, you can only really read. But if you're listening to something, you can mow the lawn or do the dishes or go for a run or something like that. And so I think I think dialogue is just naturally captivating and interesting to the human ear, and that it's a pleasing way to digest some of this intellectual stuff. So I want to thank you, Dr. Brandt, for coming on my channel and taking this risk to talk with me, someone that you knew ahead of time disagreed with you. And I really appreciate your generosity, and thank you for all of the work and scholarship that you've done and sharing that with us.
Well, and thank you for your creating this platform and inviting me.
Sure.
So, bye-bye.
Goodbye.